discover, to find our dignity. I'm convinced God's people have the power to come together and defy injustice, and not just as some easy, cheap form of oneness, but rather as a powerful movement of God's presence in us and through us for others. This evening, we offer ourselves together, recognizing the inflection point in society and God's people, which calls each of us to defy the standards of power and privilege and to live instead the standard of service and sacrifice. Our gathering as one defies the evil divisiveness in society and even in our religious gatherings. We offer ourselves as one, the many for the one for the many. God grant us the courage to lay aside our power and privilege for the sake of the other, for the sake of the needy, the hurting, the homeless, those without a roof over their head, the marginalized, and the excluded. Amen. Turn it back to you.
All right, thank you for that moment. And now we'll pass it over to Megan, who will list our partners in this cause to support renters' rights and protections.
Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Megan Carrier, Deputy Director of Together Colorado, and we are so excited to see you all here tonight, and so thankful that you gave up an evening to be with us to learn some more about, as Kelly said, SB21-173, Keep Coloradans Housed, and learn how you too can use your voice to get activated. Together Colorado is not alone in this fight, and I'm really excited that you will be able to meet both our partners 9 to 5 Colorado and COVID-19 Eviction Defense Project tonight. They will be doing presentations, and I'll let them share a little bit about who they are. But in addition to the 3 groups that are with you all tonight, we are also working with a larger collaboration of folks, Interfaith Alliance, Colorado Coalition for the Homeless, Colorado Center on Law and Policy, Enterprise, and then several other partners that are signed on to this bill. If you are new to Together Colorado, we are a multi-faith, multi-race, statewide organization that does grassroots organizing in institutions across the state, from Fort Collins to Pueblo to the Western Slope. We believe in putting dignity at the center of all our work, and believe that you all here with us and those who you represent can actually make large systemic change like housing reform that we will talk about tonight. But without further ado, I am going to pass the baton off to my partners, Dre and Javier, to lead us into the presentation tonight.
Hey everyone, I'll introduce. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
I can just do a quick introduction, and then Javier, if you want to introduce yourself, and then we'll have a couple folks tell their stories before we start the presentation. My name is Dre Chiriboga Flores. I'm the state director for 9 to 5 Colorado. We've been working on a bunch of different issues, but focusing a lot on mobile homes and tenants' rights for the past 6 or 7 years. Most of our work is centered around women's rights in the workplace, but we know that housing is a women's issue as well. A lot of folks who are being evicted are women, especially single women of color with children. And so we've made this a top priority in the past few years and have been working with Together Colorado and COVID Eviction Defense Project on some really amazing legislation that we hope will have a big impact on the state. And I will pass it to Javier.
Thank you. And thank you everybody for coming out tonight and hearing about 173 and about what you can do to help us get this legislation passed. So my name is Javier Mabry. I am the political director and a staff attorney at the COVID-19 Eviction Defense Project. We represent clients who are facing eviction in Colorado, and we're also advocating for changes to Colorado law because Colorado is one of the worst states in the country for tenants. So our job as eviction defense attorneys is incredibly difficult. It's difficult for us to bring up basic defenses, and you will hear some of that tonight. So this legislation is about basic fairness and giving people a fair day in court so that people aren't unreasonably removed from their homes. And so I believe we have 2 tenants on the call to tell their stories, and we also have one of our attorneys as well. So first, let me just see if, hang on one second. Let's see, is Catherine Azar on the line?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, great, Catherine. So Catherine is one of our tenants we represented through the eviction process, and she's going to tell you a little bit about her experience with that.
So can you hear me okay? Okay, I'm here in support of the part of SB 21-173 that has to do with landlords required to take money if the money is available to them. And my situation is that in trying to negotiate with my landlord, that negotiation was basically rejected or shut down. And so I had no other recourse but to move out of my house if I wanted to avoid eviction. So that happened last August. And since then, we've come to a settlement, but I have not gotten a new house. I've looked several times. And so it's been had that part of the legislation been in enforcement, my situation would have been completely different, and I would have been able to remain in my house, if not till now, at least for a few months more. So that's basically it.
Thank you, Catherine. Really appreciate you coming and sharing your story. Let's see, Miss Watson on the call. Nichelle Watson, are you on the call? Okay, I didn't think I saw her in the waiting room. So now I'm actually going to pass it over to Carrie DeGennaro. She is the head of the legal department at the COVID-19 Eviction Defense Project, and she is going to chat with you all a little bit about why this legislation is important.
Hi, everybody. It's so exciting to see you and to meet you all, and thank you for coming out and listening to us talk about why this is such an important piece of legislation. So as you can imagine, we see a lot of really terrible and pretty atrocious situations. And one of those cases that I will just highlight tonight is talking about when somebody has really bad conditions in their house and they also fall behind on rent. So we had a tenant that we worked with, actually down in Pueblo is where I will highlight this particular instance. And she had a range of issues with the house, including the fact that her heat wasn't working, the fact that she had a very severe mold infestation in the bathroom and the kitchen. She also had several appliances that had broken, so the stove wasn't working. And she made complaints to the property manager over and over again. Property manager didn't really want to do anything about it, and then she fell behind in rent, and in conjunction with the issues with the house, she kind of kept asking and said, can you please fix my heat? And I also have this mold problem. She's now actually been diagnosed with mold poisoning. And instead of actually addressing the issue, the landlord served her with eviction paperwork. So, you know, the issue with this currently is that in order to assert as a defense that the landlord has violated what we call the warranty of habitability. So basically, in order to say, hey, the landlord didn't make my property livable, our tenant would have had to pay the full amount of rent that she owed into the court in order to make that defense and make that argument and hold the landlord accountable. So that's another big part of why this bill is so important. And I could share stories upon stories upon stories, but thank you for letting me share that one. And I'll pass it back to you, Javier.
All right, thank you so much, Carrie. Yeah, this legislation is really, really important in terms of, you know, making sure there's a mechanism for tenants to hold their landlords accountable where they're not keeping the property safe and fit for human habitation. That story where the client got mold poisoning because the landlord refused to do anything is all too common. You know, we have another client who their landlords took their toilets out of their home for 2 weeks, and the clients had no way to go to the bathroom at their property where they were expected to pay full rent, and they could not bring that up in their non-payment eviction case. And 173 provides a mechanism for those sorts of defenses. So now I'm gonna pass it over to Drea. And Dre, did you want to share your screen? I can share mine. We're gonna go through a PowerPoint that explains the legislation to you all. Okay, great.
All right, hold on 1 second. Oops. All right. Hey everyone again, I'm Dre. So just to start, our partnership and our Renters Roundtable, we're really trying to center the work that we do around common values. We believe that all Coloradans deserve a safe place to call home, regardless of income, regardless of geography or race. And as was mentioned, Colorado right now is ranked as one of the worst states for renters. It's been ranked 41st in the country in a few studies. And one of the reasons why is because Colorado renters lack fundamental due process rights and basic protections, making it difficult for their advocates to stop evictions in court. Due to past and current racist policies and practices, communities of color are disproportionately at risk of eviction. Studies from cities across the country have shown that people of color, particularly Black and Latinx people, constitute approximately 80% of people facing eviction. One study determined that Black households are twice as likely than white households to be evicted. Evictions can lead to prolonged homelessness, mental and physical health problems, damaged credit, and poor attendance and learning outcomes among school-aged children. So these are some of the things, as I mentioned, evictions can lead to. They really can be deadly in some ways. So across the country, as I mentioned, Colorado is ranked as one of the least friendly, tenant-friendly states. This makes defending tenants in court almost impossible. Very few tenants have positive outcomes in Colorado court. So we really need to make some changes, and some of those will be mentioned today in this bill that we're running. In the Colorado context, I also just want to mention that we did a survey among 1,000 renters between 2015 and 2016. And we really we're trying to find out what are the biggest barriers for renters to actually access housing, and then actually staying in their homes, and then what does the process of eviction look like? And so we had a whole list of different issues that came up, including high application fees, maintenance issues, And then it also was very clear that the eviction process is heavily in favor of landlords. And while we have, together with other organizations, made a lot of progress in terms of passing legislation in the last couple of years, we still fall behind when we're compared to other states. And I'm happy to share any findings from that report if you're interested. So Senate Bill 173, part of the bill addresses late fees. This is not the first time we've tried to address late fees in the legislation. So we were finding like on the ground that folks were being charged excessive late fees. They were being charged sometimes as soon as, at 5 o'clock the day rent was due. If you submitted rent a minute after, you were considered late. So people were being charged immediately after. And then we even have a case right now, a class action lawsuit where we're representing a tenant, one of our members, Bobby, who was experiencing excessive late fees to the point where he was really trapped in a cycle of debt. And so this was not something we thought would be such a big issue, but the more we dug into it, the more we realized that this really spans across the whole state and is a pretty big issue. 1 in 5 renters were late on rent during the pandemic, with Black and Latino renters facing the greatest hardship. 1 in 4 Colorado renters spend more than 50% of their income on housing, while it's recommended that people pay 30 or below, 30% or lower of their income. Colorado families can be evicted for owing late fees alone right now. So even if they've already paid their rent, they're good on that. If they haven't paid off their late fees, they can be evicted. And then we've also discovered that there's Mrs. Murphy's rule is a law that was, or sort of something that was passed around fair housing laws that exempted 5 or few units because of basically older white property owners wanted to be able to have an exemption when it comes to fair housing. So basically that they wouldn't have to abide by civil rights legislation related to protections around race. And that's something that's come up in the legislation is carving out 5 or few units, landlords who own 5 or few units. So the legislation this year is similar to last year regarding late fees. So it does a few things, 4 things mainly. First, it limits late fees to a set percentage and dollar amount and a set time frame before a late fee can be imposed. So basically what that means is not only can landlords not charge over a certain amount, they also have to provide a grace period before they actually start charging. So they can't charge, on day, well, the hope is that they won't be able to charge on day 3. They have to wait a few days so that person can catch up on rent. And as we know, especially during the pandemic, that's been really, really important because sometimes accessing sources of funding to subsidize housing it takes a while. You can't get it in one day. Sometimes it takes a week or 2. And so having that grace period can help tenants from racking up those fees. It also requires late fees to be included in leases so that people are not caught off guard, and requires landlords to provide 180 days notice for any change in late fee policies. And then it also prohibits tenants from being evicted just for owing late fees. So that's really the bulk of what this piece of the legislation will look like. And I'll pass it to Javier to talk about the eviction court reform piece of it.
Great, thank you. Yeah, so just want to stress the late fee piece of this before I move on into the court reform. We're really grateful that 9 to 5 and other organizations have been organizing around this late fee cap for so many years. It's so needed. I remember at some point last year, we heard of a client who because there is no cap on late fees, landlords can compound them, charge them per day. We heard of a tenant who had late fees as high as I think it was $1,200 after they were behind 2 months in rent, which was around 50% of their rent, which was insane. I mean, that means that the person is essentially getting evicted for the late fees alone. And so this the late fee piece of this bill is really critical. So to truly address Colorado's eviction crisis, there needs to be massive changes to the law. Now, I keep meaning to take this slide out of the PowerPoint because there are too many words here. But I'm going to get into each of these bullet points. Basically, the eviction court reform legislation provides rights to renters on the timeline in which they can catch up to rent on their rent, which is what Ms. Azar spoke about at the beginning of the call. It allows renters to bring up health and safety defenses without being without having to pay excessive fees and being priced out of court. It prevents landlords from punishing tenants for being evicted above and beyond what the law provides. Obviously, tenants can still owe their landlords damages if they're evicted, but right now Colorado law has no bar on the amount of damages that a landlord can contract into the lease and punish tenants above and beyond the normal eviction process. And we're also trying to help tenants hold their landlords accountable when they are illegally evicted. That means a landlord has evicted a tenant without going through the normal court process. We call these illegal lockouts. This is, the tenant shows up one day from the grocery store and their lock has been changed. Okay, next slide. Okay, so the first major piece of this legislation is about giving renters more time to catch up on their rent and avoid the eviction. Now, this provision of the law does not actually extend the eviction process. What it does is it allows renters to use the entire eviction process to pay their back rent and avoid the eviction. So under current law, Colorado renters only have a 10-day notice period in which they have to pay all their back rent and late fees or face eviction. So in the 10-day notice, so the way the eviction process starts is on the second day of the month, if the tenant has not paid their rent, a landlord can post an eviction notice. Eviction notices in Colorado are 10 days long. The tenant has that whole 10-day period to pay their rent and avoid the eviction. But on the 11th day, the landlord is no longer under any obligation to accept rent and allow the renter to stay in their home. What our legislation does is it allows renters to catch up on their back rent and stay in their homes after the eviction notice has expired and up until the point that the judge issues a judgment. So basically the way that this works is the eviction notice will start the eviction clock, right? You'll have 10-day notice before the landlord can go to court and get papers to sue you as a tenant for eviction. On the 11th day, the day after the notice expires, the landlord can go to court, get a lawsuit, tape it to your door, and then you will be required to show up in court 7 days later. Typically, the courts across the state hold trials on that same day. We are providing a 7-day extension that says if a tenant files a response to their landlord to the lawsuit, then they get a week to prepare for trial. Anyways, the important thing here is that the tenants will have the entire eviction process to pay all the rent that they owe their landlord and avoid the eviction. This is so critically important because right now the rent relief timeline is longer than the eviction timeline. So landlords don't really have much of an incentive to wait and cooperate with their tenants while their tenants access rent relief, because it's quicker to evict them. What we want to do is make sure that tenants have more time to come up with the rent that they owe their landlord and avoid eviction. Okay, next slide. Okay, so this next piece is really important, and Carrie spoke to it earlier. The example I gave with the client who had their toilets removed from their home also gets at this issue. So what's important to know framing this up is under Colorado law and the law of every state, your landlord is obligated to provide you a home that is fit for human habitation. This is called the warranty of habitability. Good way to think of this is if you are renting to a tenant and you're a landlord, you have an obligation to provide a safe and habitable home. This means that it should have functioning heat, that it should have running water, functioning plumbing, should be free of pests like bed bugs and rodents. Well, in Colorado, if your landlord is violating this right, you cannot bring it up in your eviction case unless you post bond with the court. Bond is basically a fee that is set in the hundreds or thousands of dollars. And this bond prices tenants out of bringing up these basic health and safety issues when they're getting evicted. So we're trying to reform this to give renters a leg to stand on in their eviction hearings. This is critically important because we need to create an added incentive for landlords to comply with the warranty of habitability. You know, the poorest clients, the poorest renters in Colorado cannot afford to hire attorneys, cannot afford to take time off work and go through and affirmatively sue their landlords for violations of the warranty of habitability. The most likely place that they would be able to bring up issues like the mold poisoning would be if they were getting evicted. And so we want to get rid of the bond and allow renters to have a fair day in court. Now, I see a question in the chat, a couple questions in the chat about why the bond was put in place. The bond was put in place when the warranty of habitability was established in Colorado because property owners lobbied for it and said that it was necessary to prevent tenants from bringing frivolous warranty of habitability claims, right? Well, I mean, you can see why they would be worried about that. But the problem is, if a tenant was frivolously bringing a warranty of habitability claim, they would be evicted and they would have a money judgment against them and a judgment for attorney's fees against them on the same eviction timeline that we have now. So many states do not have this bond requirement, right? And we're trying to get rid of it because we think this is about basic fairness. And you know, if a tenant is bringing a frivolous claim, there's already plenty of disincentive against that, right? There's being homeless, having an eviction on your record, having a money judgment against you, and the courts process these evictions on a very fast timeline. The eviction timeline in Colorado is 3 to 4 weeks. And so we think that there's plenty of disincentive to not bring a frivolous claim. And so this concern about frivolous claims has priced out the poorest Coloradans from being able to say anything about the condition of their homes. You know, think about a single mom who lost their job due to COVID, their basement flooded, there's mold issues, there's you know, issues with rodents, whatever it may be, and they can't bring that up in court, and they already didn't have enough money to pay their rent. If they can come up with the money to pay the bond, they'd probably save it to try to find another place. And so what we've basically done out of a concern for stopping frivolous claims is price the poorest Coloradans out of a fair day in court. One rental payment has to be missed for the landlord to evict a tenant, and it can be as quick as the second day of the month. If a tenant is late on the second day of a month, a landlord can move forward with the eviction process. And the average eviction timeline in other states is around 30 days, I'd say, in most states, although there are several where the eviction timeline is more like 45, 60, or 90 days, the states that are most tenant friendly. And, you know, with this legislation, we're not even approaching those sorts of timelines. We're just looking for reasonable fixes here. Okay, next slide. Thank you for working the PowerPoint, by the way. The next provision of this bill has to do with something that's called a liquidated damage clause. Now, a liquidated damage clause is basically something found in the fine print of your lease. This is a hidden clause in your lease that punishes you for violations. Now, an example of a liquidated damage clause might say that a renter owes $4,000 in damages in addition to whatever they owed the landlord in back rent, etc., for breaking their lease. Now, these $4,000 punishments are actually quite common. We didn't pull that number out of thin air. Our friend Aubrey, who works with the Colorado Coalition for the Homeless, her lease last year had a clause that was $4,000 liquidated damage clause. And, you know, these clauses punish renters above and beyond the normal eviction process, right? The eviction process already punishes tenants enough. There's tenants owe attorney's fees, they owe back rent, court fees. The landlords are adequately compensated if a tenant loses in their eviction case. So these liquidated damage clauses are problematic because A, evictions were already punishment enough, but B, they created an incentive for landlords to see the eviction process through to the end and made it difficult for renters who needed to break their lease for whatever reason to do so and move on without having to deal with the landlord having the extra incentive to take their tenant to court. And so, you know, we don't want landlords to have an added incentive to not negotiate with tenants who, you know, maybe lost their job due to the pandemic, you know, or are otherwise down on their luck. Related to this is we want to disallow clauses that only award attorney's fees to landlords. So another common thing in the fine print of leases are clauses that say, if the landlord wins an eviction, they get attorney's fees. Well, we want to make sure that if there's anything having to do with attorney's fees, that if the tenant wins in court, they also get attorney's fees. We're not stopping landlords from getting attorney's fees if they win. We just want to make sure that that goes both ways. Okay, next slide. Okay, so this next one is a big one, particularly in immigrant and undocumented communities. Landlords take advantage of monolingual Spanish speakers and the fact that they might be afraid to avail themselves of the courts, you know, don't understand the process, and they'll act beyond the scope of the law, and they'll evict the tenants simply by changing the locks. This is already against the law, right? In order to evict somebody legally in Colorado, you have to post an eviction notice like I described before, go to court, get a lawsuit on the day after the eviction notice expired, and walk through that normal process. If you don't do that, you've already violated the law. The problem is that there is not enough of a mechanism for tenants to punish their landlords where this has happened. You know, right now the law only provides damages for what's called economic damages. And so you can't really sue your landlord if you lose property in this that might have sentimental value, for example. So our friend Jack, who works with us on this legislation, he works at CCLP, Colorado Center for Law and Policy, tells his story that he heard of a client who their landlord came, changed their locks, threw everything out, all the tenants' possessions, including the remains of the tenant's son. There was an urn with the tenant's son's ashes in it, and the landlord threw it away. And under current Colorado law, there's no way to get damages for that. And so we want to create a statutory penalty that says these sorts of evictions harm people beyond economic damages. So we're providing a penalty. The legislation initially authorized the Attorney General to go after landlords who violated the law in this way, but I think there are discussions of that coming up. But right now, I think it's still in. But that would be another critical protection, right? If landlords knew that this sort of violation could be reported to the AG, they'd be less likely to behave in this way. So next slide. So I'll just touch on this one briefly. We want to provide an opportunity for tenants to request documents from their landlord if an eviction case is pending. So basically, when the tenant shows up to court and files a response to their landlord, we're giving them an opportunity to ask their landlord through the court for, the rent ledger, for example, or emails related to the case. This will give tenants an opportunity to prepare for their eviction hearings. Okay, next slide. Okay, so there are some additional smaller protections in this bill. The first one says no default judgments before the close of business. This is really important because right now there are some courts, Adams County is an example, that don't allow tenants to respond if they show up after 12 o'clock noon. And so tenants will know that they have a return date in court. They'll see, for example, I have to return May the 4th. And, maybe they'll show up at 1 o'clock and then they'll learn that a default judgment had entered against them. This is basically a ruling by the court that says you didn't show up to your court date and your landlord has won automatically. We want the court to be open till the end of the day to give working people the opportunity to respond to court documents. Again, I mentioned this earlier, we want to give tenants a week to prepare for their trials, so no more same day trials. And we're also requiring that additional information about legal assistance and rent relief will be included in court paperwork. And we want to make it easier for tenants to appeal their cases as well. And we'll open it up for questions here in a second, but just want to emphasize the importance of this legislation. This issue is quite personal to me. When I was a teenager, my family was evicted. In the aftermath, I dropped out of high school. And, we know that evictions can have devastating consequences, and it's far too easy to evict tenants in Colorado right now. And tenants don't have the opportunity to bring up basic defenses to try to prevent these from happening. And that's what this legislation is all about. And now I think we're going to open it up for questions.
Awesome. Folks can popcorn questions. I did see one in the chat for Dre, if you'd like, or Javier. One of them was our late fee in the bill. Our late fee, is it late fee caps in total, or is it a per day?
Yeah, I think Mary might have answered that. Yeah, so it would be in total, there would be potentially just one fee that can be charged the whole month. The housing authorities did request, because they actually charge 2 late fees, which I don't know, I was surprised that they do charge late fees, but it's split. And so they requested that 2 could be charged, so it's not one lump sum. And so we've talked about it. Basically, you could charge 2 different fees, but it still could not go past that same limit in total. If that makes sense. And I can also, I'll share in the chat the report that we did. I think someone requested that. Do we have a field for the vote count? That's a good question. This has been a very, very controversial bill. It's probably the most controversial housing bill in the legislature right now. We are still trying to push a few legislators to support this. It will be in the business committee in the House. It's helpful we can put the list of like who's in that committee and who will be voting on it next week. But if we're hoping to make some changes to strengthen it still. So yeah, it is a controversial bill. Hard to say at this point, the chances of passing. I think it depends on what amendments we add, but we are really trying to stay strong on the bill that we proposed and not backpedal or not water it down as much as possible. But that's why advocacy is so important and organizing is so important, so that we can hold the line and show like we want to actually change the status quo, right? We don't want to just have things that maybe landlords, we don't want to have like, you know, a 7-day notice to cure for late fees. That still isn't a lot of time for folks. And so the more folks that reach out and say, we need a strong policy, we can't afford to water this down, and this is why, the stronger the policy will be.
It's like also, go ahead.
I just wanted to pick up on that point real quick and just emphasize the fact that the Business and Labor Committee is not at all a friendly committee. We're quite disappointed with that assignment. In the Senate, we are assigned to Senate State Affairs. And, you know, I just think that this is an example that, you know, even with full Democratic control of the legislature, we have to fight and keep Democratic members honest. And, you know, I'm going to drop an action alert a link to an action alert in the chat where people can click it and email their legislators, but we'll also drop a link to the Business and Labor Committee, and everybody here should email the members of the Business and Labor Committee and tell them that they support this legislation as well.
Javier, I'm able to drop a link into, or oh, go ahead. Okay, great, perfect. Here's a link to the committee.
Okay, there's a few other questions in the chat.
And let's Oscar, you have your hand raised. Do you have a question? And then
yes, thank you for the opportunity. This is my first time in this meeting, and it's amazing all the things that I'm hearing, and I'm very happy to be here. So I hear all these horrible things. Wow, it's impressive. Some of those I didn't know in detail. But I'm also hearing that we're like number 10 when it comes to the fairness of this, right? And I like to know what would be a good scenario. Who is number 1 when it comes to favoring housing or fair housing, let's say, and what should we learn from those, and who would be someone to imitate, or what state, and what kind of rules they have, if someone could tell me that are more affected or more fair to, especially to the Latino community in this case, that we hear is very unfortunately affected by this, and others, poor, homeless, all those. So who is a good like I say, state to imitate or good law that we would like to have in a good scenario, right? Please, thank you.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there are many, many states that are much better than Colorado. And I think, you know, as tenant advocates, obviously we would want to implement the most tenant friendly policies that we could get passed. You know, the most friendly states for renters are Vermont, Connecticut, Delaware, California is another pretty friendly state for landlords. I think we have a long, long way to go before we get there. You know, those states have policies that are anti-gentrification policies that prevent communities from getting uprooted due to the housing crisis. Now, obviously, gentrification is still uprooting folks, even in a state like California, where they do have policies like just cause for eviction that keep communities who cannot afford to buy homes together. Obviously, that would be ideal. I would love it if we could pass some anti-gentrification policies in Colorado, along with the development of affordable housing. That would be great. In the meantime, we're just looking at trying to give renters a fair day in court and try to prevent renters from getting evicted just based on late fees alone. And if we could make those steps in this legislative session, I think we would do a really good thing for working folks. But I think long term, you know, there are lessons to learn from states like California, Connecticut, Delaware, Vermont. I don't know if you have anything to add, Dre or Megan.
Well, I was going to say thank you to everyone who has shared your stories with us tonight and these insights and some examples of what this bill will do. Thank you for everyone who's asked excellent questions. Please continue to ask questions in the chat and we'll try our best to answer those. But right now we'll pass it over to Elder Norm, who will lead us into our call of action for this evening.
All right, thank you, everybody. You know, like any good sermon, not only was this informational and motivational, but there's application too. So this is not just a spectator sport. Until recently, earlier this year at reorg, I was the chair of House District 37's Democratic Party. And for the past 3 years, I've been an active member of the Denver Metro Caucus of Together Colorado. In both roles, I've witnessed firsthand the power of our collective voices. So this is very important. This is as important as understanding what's in the bill, is understanding what we can do about it. Our opinion and our voice matters. Our government works for us. I have a very close personal relationship with our Representative Tom Sullivan, and I know that he listens to his constituents. So a little factoid is that the majority of our state legislators have jobs outside of the legislature, and they depend on us for some of the information and to hear what's most important to us so that they can represent us. So there's something we can do right now, and that's to reach out to them. As you've heard already tonight, that's the action that we can all do, and it is fairly simple. There's a link right here. It's showing up in our chat where we can email or send a tweet to our legislator. Earlier tonight, I was on a site that has, you enter your address and it tells you who your state senator and state representatives are. But it's also important, and this link was here today in our chat, who is on the committee, so that we can get to them and make sure they hear what matters to us. So please copy these, put them aside so that you can link to these right after tonight's presentation. are we ready for closing? Okay, I'm seeing all kinds of nods, and it's not that you're nodding off. That's good. Okay. So I am going to pray us out with a bit of a nod to my faith tradition. So here goes. Sovereign God, one common theme throughout all our faith traditions is to remain thankful for the blessings we've received along the way, and in that thankfulness, extend a generous spirit to those in need. For example, in Scripture, Galatians 5 extols us, you, my brothers and sisters, were called to be free, but do not use your freedom to indulge the flesh. Rather, serve one another humbly in love. For the entire law is fulfilled in keeping this one command: love your neighbor as yourself. If you bite and devour each other, watch out, or you will be destroyed by each other. So as we leave here tonight, let us all be reminded of the virtues of demonstrating empathy to those in need, and be thankful for that spirit when our time of need may happen. May God bless you all. Amen.
Raise your voice, stand together.
Thanks, everyone.